In previous videos, we have talked about shutter speed and aperture in a very basic way. In this video, we are going to talk about how they work together. So just to review, what we already know about shutter speed and aperture is that your shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second, and you can have a shorter shutter speed, so it opens and closes very quickly, all the way to a longer shutter speed where it opens and then closes and there's more time in between. That's one way that light gets into your camera. The other way that light gets into your camera to hit the digital sensor in the back is through the lens. And in the lens, there's actually this mechanism that can be turned so you have a smaller hole. Let's use this. So we have a smaller hole, or it can be opened up increasingly to get a larger hole. Now, of course, a smaller hole lets in less light, and a larger hole will let in more light. The visual effects of these two different things is this. If we have a smaller hole, we have a greater depth of field. So we can see that in this picture. Let's ignore the pigeons for a second, but we can see that the bricks here are in focus, but so are the trees in the background. So it is a greater depth of field. So smaller hole, greater the depth of field, more is in focus. While with a larger hole in the aperture, we actually have shallow depth of field. So the bricks in the front are in focus, but the trees in the background are out of focus. And all right. Now, focus is different than motion blur, and that's controlled by your shutter speed. So if you have a longer time that shutter is open, you will get blurred motion because these things have a chance to move while that shutter is open. While if you have a very short amount of time that the shutter is open, it freezes motion. So again, focus and depth of field is different than motion. All right, so how do these two things work together? Well, let's say that we have a larger aperture, but open for a shorter amount of time. Then we get this much light coming in. But if we have a smaller hole, but open for a longer amount of time, we still actually get the same amount of light coming in. If it's kind of hard to compare this and see that they're the same amount, let's look at these buckets over here in this metaphor. If I have a faucet that's just dripping a little bit, right? I've kind of closed it off, so it's just dripping a little bit, but it's open for a long time, so small hole, long time, I fill up the bucket. But it's the same thing if I have a larger stream of water at a shorter amount of time, I still fill up the bucket. So as you can see, you can have an equivalent with a larger aperture with a shorter amount of time is equivalent to a smaller aperture with a longer amount of time. But if you change one of those settings, it's going to affect the amount of light let into the camera. So this is a light meter. It's judging how much light there is coming into the camera. Your camera is generally pretty happy most of the time if the amount of light that comes in is in this center little notch. So this camera, this means 125 means 1/125th of a second, and this is the f-stop, f16, which is a smaller hole. So a smaller hole at this time gives me the right amount of light. But if I make that hole larger, so I go to f11, which is a larger hole, now I can see, oh, I'm actually letting in too much light. Or even at the same shutter speed, if I make that f-stop or that hole in the aperture smaller, then I'm not letting in enough light. So what does that actually look like? Well, here we see, that's that first example. We're letting in the right amount of light. But if we let in too much light, our picture is going to be blown out and overexposed. However, if we don't let in enough light to the camera, our picture might end up being too dark. You may notice that This picture, this exposure, the amount of lightness and darkness, is actually very similar to this one and this one. That's that equivalent going on. That's that kind of bucket of water. This would be a medium aperture and a medium shutter speed, and they give you a certain, like in this example, the right amount of light. But you could actually have a larger aperture with a shorter shutter speed, and you would still get the same amount of light. Or you can have a faster shutter speed, but a bigger hole in that aperture to let in more light, and it will still be equivalent. Now let's look at some numbers that show that idea that we were just looking at. If my camera meter is telling me that for the amount of light in a room, f8 at 1/60th is going to give that camera the correct amount of light to get a proper exposure, to get it not too light, not too dark, but just right, then I know that f8 at 1/60th will work. And I will get, a little bit shallow depth of field and a little bit of motion blur. But maybe I don't want that. Maybe I want more shallow depth of field and more motion blur. And if that's the case, you can always go up one and down the other. I'm letting in less light with my aperture because I have a smaller hole. It would be greater depth of field. A smaller hole, but I am letting in more light with my shutter speed. So it kind of evens out. It's a different combination, but it still lets in the same amount of light. Let's take that one step further. If I say, no, I've got things moving around and I really need to get my cousin who's running around the living room and I need to get her not blurred, my little baby cousin, then I say, actually I want 1/125th of a second. I need a faster shutter speed, but because I'm cutting down the light with my shutter speed, I need to add more light in with my aperture. So yeah, it's going to be more shallow depth of field, but at least my cousin isn't a big blur as she runs past. Now you can take that to the extreme. You may say, actually, I want tons of blur, or I want everything in focus. I don't want shallow depth of field. There's people in the background and I want them to be in focus, or there's other things in the background and I want everything to be in focus. Well, look, if we started here at f8 1/60th, if your camera's saying this is the right amount of light, you can go down 3 stops as long as you go up 3 stops. Let's get the little marker there. So we can go down 3 stops as long as we go up 3 stops. So we're letting in less light with our aperture, but more light with our shutter speed. We could do it the other way too. Again, it's a different combination, but it is equal to each other. And this diagram may help. So if f8 at 1/125 works, then also going up 1 and down the other would work. Going up 1 and up 2 and down 2 would work. Going up 3 and down 3 would work, and that works the other way as well. All of these combinations are equivalent to each other. They all let in the same amount of light. But they have very different visual effects, because a larger aperture will give us shallow depth of field, a smaller aperture will give us greater depth of field. Here we will have blurred motion, and down here we will have frozen motion. So just to take this one step further, think of, in this metaphor, pizza is light. Your camera's digital sensor wants a certain amount of light. It wants a certain amount of pizza. It is always hungry for the same amount of pizza. All right? It doesn't care if it's half cheese and half pepperoni, if it's 3/4 cheese and 1/4 pepperoni, or 3/4 pepperoni, 1/4 cheese. It doesn't care. It just wants a whole pizza. All right? So here, we could say, you're letting in half your light with your shutter speed and half with your aperture, or maybe you're letting in more light with your shutter speed and less with your aperture, or less with your shutter speed and you're letting in more light with your aperture. It all ends up being the same. So here you can see, here we're letting in more light with our slower shutter speed, but we have a greater depth of field here. Or we're adding in more light with our aperture, but we're letting in less light with our shutter speed. So you can see all three of these are equivalent. All three of these are those different combinations of pizza. But there's one more thing that we have to layer on top of this, and that's ISO. So there's a certain amount of light in a room, and we can slide these shutter and aperture up and down, right? But we can actually change the amount of light that your camera wants. Because sometimes there's more light in a situation, and sometimes there's less light in a situation. So then let's look what happens when you are in a different lighting situation. So remember our original example, f8 at 1/60th gave your camera the proper exposure for the amount of light in the room. Well, what if there's just a lot less light? Then that first setting is going to have to be shifted over. There needs to be more light let in, both with the shutter speed and the aperture. So now our new normal, our new starting place would be f4 at 1/15th, because we're letting in more light with our aperture and with our shutter speed. Because the camera just needs more light because there's not as much light available. It still wants that whole pizza, right? It's just that there's not as much around. So we have to let in more. I guess that pizza metaphor doesn't really work there, but still wants the same amount of light, but there's not as much in the room. So we have to let more in. We have to have ways to let much more light into the room. But just like before, different combinations still work. So if this is our new normal, we can say, you know what though? Like 1/15th is just going to be too much motion blur for me. I can't really go at anything lower than 1/30th. So I'm going to do 1/30th. So I'm letting in a little less light with my shutter speed, but then I'll just let in more light with my aperture, and I'll just have a more shallow depth of field photo. So again, if there's less light in the room, your new normal would be letting in more light, and you can still make adjustments. Just like if there's super tons of light in the room, your new normal might start over here, and then you could make adjustments this way. Oh, let's turn this on. You can make adjustments this way or this way, depending on the visual effect that you want in your photos. Okay, the last thing that can affect your photos is the ISO. And the ISO is something that can be really great and really frustrating at the same time. So we have the amount of light that's in the room. We have our shutter and our aperture letting in light to hit the camera. But you can actually change, to go back to the pizza metaphor, you can actually change how hungry your camera is for light. So at ISO 100, use that in a very sunny location, there's a lot of light available, and so it's okay. You can say, hey, my camera's pizza is really big, but there's so much light around. That's fine. I can make a big pizza out of all that light. But let's say there's not a lot of light around. You can actually make your camera want less light. So the higher you go with your ISO number, the less light that it's okay getting. So here it has light being water. We talked about it being pizza. I'll show you that in a second. But it determines how sensitive your camera is to light. So you can change your ISO to make your camera more sensitive to light or less sensitive to light. If it's super sunny out, it can be less sensitive to light. So the lower the number, the less sensitive it is to light. But the higher the number, the more sensitive it is to light. It will just suck in all that light out of the room to get it onto that sensor. However, there's a catch. At a lower ISO, you get less noise. Those are those speckles that you sometimes see in your camera, especially if you ever take a picture inside at night with your cell phone. You definitely might see those speckles if it's really like a dark situation. And back in the film days, it was called grain, but we call it noise with digital cameras. But yeah, it's great that I can change my ISO to a higher number. So up here, like 6400, I can take pictures in definitely darkened rooms. But the trade-off is I get way more noise. So yes, I can take pictures in darker rooms, but I get way more noise. So here we go back to the pizzas. If this was the original amount of pizzas, which would probably be like, I don't know, ISO 400 or something. If there's tons of light, then yeah, we can like feed our camera way more pizza, or our our camera can be more sensitive to light and need less of it because there's less around. But so that's why we have that smaller pizza. It's okay eating a smaller pizza. However, the trade-off is going to be that noise. Actually, the trade-off is going to be that noise. So those are the three things that we use to control our exposure in our camera: our shutter speed, our aperture, the combinations that they make to let in light, and then we can change the amount of light our camera needs in the first place, which will then, of course, change those combinations by changing our ISO. If you have any questions, please let me know. That's what I'm here for.